Long before the pyramids of Egypt or the rise of Rome, there was a land where human civilization first took shape. A place where writing, cities, and organized government were born. Ancient Sumeria. Nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, this was the cradle of human history. But what was life really like in Sumeria? How did people live, work, and dream over 5,000 years ago? In this journey, we'll uncover the realities of Sumerian daily life, from their bustling cities and ingenious inventions to their gods, myths, and the first written laws. We'll step into the dusty streets of Ur, listen to the prayers of priests, and witness the dawn of civilization itself. If you enjoy discovering where our world truly began, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's begin our story. Between the winding courses of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers lay a region that would forever change the destiny of humankind. It was here, in southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, that the first great experiment in civilization began. The land of Sumer, as it came to be known, did not emerge from lush forests or gentle valleys, but from a harsh and unpredictable environment that demanded ingenuity, cooperation, and the will to survive. The soil, rich with river silt, was a gift renewed each year by floods, yet these same waters could also destroy everything if they rose too high or arrived too soon. Life in Sumer was a constant negotiation between humanity and nature, and in that tension, civilization was born. The Sumerians were not the first to settle near rivers, but they were the first to master them on such a scale. Early settlers, arriving around 4500 BCE, found a flat, open plain with few trees, little rain, and blistering summers. The rivers, though, offered life, if one could control them. To survive, these communities began digging canals to carry water from the rivers into their fields. This was no small task. It required organization, planning, and the cooperation of hundreds of people. Over time, irrigation networks spread like veins across the land, transforming barren soil into fertile farmland. Wheat, barley, dates, and flax flourished. Herds of sheep and goats grazed along canal banks. Where once there had been wilderness, now rose villages, the first hints of cities. But this new prosperity came with new challenges. Managing irrigation required rules, labor distribution, and leadership. Canals had to be maintained, water shared, disputes settled. The simple life of small communities began to evolve into something larger, more complex. People started to specialize, and some worked the fields, others crafted tools or managed the flow of water. As population grew, coordination became essential, and from this need emerged the foundations of government. The earliest Sumerian leaders were likely priest-kings, chosen not only for their ability to command, but for their connection to the divine. In Sumer, politics and religion were never far apart. The geography of Sumer was both a blessing and a curse. Its open plains made it ideal for agriculture, but left it exposed to invasion. Without mountains or forests to act as barriers, the Sumerians were always vulnerable to neighbors from the north and east. To protect themselves, they built walls, enormous mud-brick defenses that surrounded their growing cities. Yet these same walls also symbolized something greater: humanity's first conscious effort to create an ordered world within a chaotic one. Inside them, people could plan, build, and dream together. Resources were scarce. There was little stone or metal in southern Mesopotamia, forcing the Sumerians to trade with distant lands. From the north came timber and precious metals. From the east, stone and lapis lazuli. The need for trade spurred new technologies: boats for river travel, wheeled carts for overland routes, and record-keeping systems to track exchanges. This interdependence connected far-flung communities, weaving them into a web of commerce and communication that stretched beyond the horizon. The environment also shaped their worldview. The Sumerians saw their gods in every element of the natural world: in the rivers that sustained them, in the sun that scorched their fields, in the wind that swept across the plains. They believed the gods had created humans to serve them, to maintain order in a world that otherwise leaned toward chaos. Every flood, drought, or storm was seen as a divine message. This belief would later become the foundation of their complex religious system, one that gave rise to temples, rituals, and myths that still echo in the stories of later civilizations. What made Sumer remarkable was not just its geography, but what people did with it. Faced with constant adversity, they responded with innovation. They invented irrigation, built the first urban centers, and developed social hierarchies to manage them. They learned to store surplus crops, enabling trade and specialization. Farmers became craftsmen, craftsmen became merchants, and merchants became scribes and priests. The cycle of survival gave birth to culture. By around 3500 BCE, Sumeria had transformed from scattered farming communities into a landscape of organized city-states. Each city, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, stood as an independent world, surrounded by fields and canals, governed by its own rulers, and watched over by its patron god. The once empty plain between the Tigris and Euphrates now glimmered with the lights of human ambition. The geography that once threatened to extinguish life had instead forced humanity to unite, to plan, and to build. The rivers no longer ruled the people had learned to rule the rivers. And in that mastery, they had taken the first step toward what we now call civilization. Sumer was no longer just a land of survival. It was a land of beginnings, where humankind first learned to shape the earth to its will and to dream of permanence in a world that had once seemed only temporary. As the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia filled with villages and farms, something extraordinary began to take shape. Around 3500 BCE, these clusters of small settlements started to merge into larger, more complex centers, the world's first true cities. What emerged from the Sumerian plains were not merely places to live, but intricate systems of power, religion, and innovation. They became the foundation of what we now call civilization. The names of these cities still echo across history: Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, Kish. Each was a self-contained world, an independent city-state with its own ruler, patron deity, economy, and distinct character. Together they formed the heart of ancient Sumer. Among them, Uruk stood supreme. Often considered the first major city in human history, Uruk grew to encompass tens of thousands of people, an enormous population for its time. Its walls, built of sun-baked bricks, stretched over 6 miles, enclosing temples, workshops, homes, and bustling markets. Within these walls, the idea of urban life was born. There were craftsmen shaping clay into tablets and pottery, weavers producing fine textiles, and merchants selling goods from distant lands. Uruk was not simply a collection of people. It was an organized organism, a living system that required constant coordination and governance. At the center of every Sumerian city stood its most important structure, the temple. Rising above the flat landscape, the temple complex, or ziggurat, symbolized both spiritual devotion and civic pride. The ziggurat was more than a religious monument. It was the heart of economic and political life. The god or goddess of the city was believed to be its true ruler, and the priests acted as their earthly administrators. The temple managed land, collected taxes in the form of grain and goods, and distributed food to workers. It was the first institution to organize labor and control resources on a grand scale. Religion, economy, and politics were deeply intertwined. The temple's storage rooms overflowed with barley, dates, and wool, all meticulously recorded on clay tablets by early scribes using the newly invented cuneiform script. These records formed the backbone of Sumerian bureaucracy, marking the beginning of written history. Every delivery, transaction, and labor contribution was documented, ensuring accountability and order. Writing had not yet become a tool for storytelling. It was born from the need to manage society. Yet as cities grew wealthier and more powerful, authority began to shift. The priesthood that once governed in the name of the gods gave way to rulers who wielded both divine and military power. These early kings, or lugal, emerged from the necessity to protect cities and maintain control. The flat plains of Sumer offered no natural defenses, and conflicts over water, land, and trade were constant. To survive, cities needed strong leaders capable of organizing armies and forging alliances. Thus began the age of kingship. Each city-state functioned like a small kingdom. Uruk might go to war with Lagash. Ur might strike an alliance with Kish. Though they shared a common language and culture, Rivalry was the natural state among them. Kings built monumental walls and grand temples to display their might and divine favor. They also commissioned inscriptions celebrating their victories and piety, early propaganda carved into stone. The idea that rulers derived their power from the gods became a defining principle of Mesopotamian politics, one that would endure for millennia. Trade connected these cities to one another and to lands far beyond the horizon. The Sumerians exchanged grain, wool and crafted goods for timber from Lebanon, copper from Oman, and precious stones from Iran and Afghanistan. Rivers became the arteries of commerce, carrying boats laden with goods between city ports. Overland caravans crossed deserts, linking Sumer with distant cultures. This flow of goods also brought ideas, new technologies, artistic styles, and religious concepts. Through trade, Sumer became not only a center of material wealth, but a crossroads of innovation. The growth of commerce spurred urban expansion. Streets lined with workshops buzzed with activity, metalworkers shaping bronze tools, potters turning clay, and jewelers setting lapis lazuli into intricate ornaments. In the markets, farmers traded produce, while scribes kept track of every exchange. Behind this activity lay an increasingly complex social structure. At the top were the ruling elites, priests, nobles, and administrators, followed by merchants, artisans, and farmers. At the bottom were slaves, often captives of war, who worked the fields and temples. Every person had a role in maintaining the rhythm of the city. The Sumerians' achievement was not just in building walls or temples, but in creating an organized society where cooperation was essential. Their cities were living examples of human coordination, thousands of individuals bound together by shared faith, mutual dependence, and collective ambition. The temple's shadow reminded them of their gods, the city's walls reminded them of their unity. By 3000 BCE, Sumer had become a constellation of thriving city-states, each radiating its own light across the plains. From the high terraces of Uruk's ziggurat to the bustling docks of Ur, Sumerian cities stood as the first great human experiment in order and complexity. Here people no longer lived only to survive. They lived to build, to trade, to record, and to worship. The birth of the Sumerian city-states marked the moment when humanity stepped firmly into history, when the world ceased to be merely nature's domain and became unmistakably the world of man. Life in ancient Sumer was shaped by rhythm, the rhythm of the rivers, the seasons, the markets, and the gods. But beneath the grandeur of temples and palaces, it was the daily routines of ordinary men and women that truly defined this world's character. For every king or priest whose name was carved into stone, there were thousands of farmers, potters, merchants, and laborers whose hands built and sustained the first cities. Their days, though simple, were part of the great machinery that powered civilization itself. Most Sumerians lived in modest homes, built from sun-dried mud brick, the most abundant material in a land with little stone or wood. The walls were thick to keep out the brutal heat, and roofs were flat, often used as sleeping areas during hot summer nights. Wealthier families had houses with several rooms arranged around a central courtyard where light and air could enter. Poorer homes were smaller, sometimes only a single room. Streets were narrow and winding, filled with the sounds of animals, children, and vendors calling out their goods. Life was lived close to the earth, dusty, noisy, and vibrant. At dawn, the city stirred to life. Farmers left for the fields beyond the city walls, guiding plows pulled by oxen through irrigated furrows. Craftsmen opened their workshops, pounding copper, shaping clay, or weaving wool. Women fetched water from public wells or canals, prepared meals, and tended to household shrines dedicated to protective deities. Families were large, and life expectancy was short, so every member of the household had a task. Boys might learn their father's trade, while girls helped with weaving or food preparation. The family was the heart of Sumerian society. Marriage was considered a practical arrangement rather than a romantic one, often negotiated between families to strengthen social or economic ties. A wife's main duties were to manage the household and bear children, though women could also own property, conduct business, and even run taverns. Inscriptions reveal that some women worked as priestesses or scribes, suggesting that Sumerian society, while patriarchal, recognized women's value in economic and religious life. Food in Sumer reflected both the bounty and limitations of the land. The fertile soil provided grains like barley and wheat, which were ground into flour for bread or fermented into beer, a staple drink for all classes. Dates, onions, garlic, lentils, and fish from the rivers were common ingredients. Meat was rarer, reserved mostly for the wealthy or for special occasions. Meals were simple but filling, and communal eating was central to family life. Archaeological finds of clay bowls, drinking vessels, and cooking pots tell stories of shared meals in homes and temples alike. Clothing, too, reflected one's status. Men typically wore skirts made of sheep's wool or linen, wrapped and tied at the waist, while women dressed in long draped garments. The rich displayed their status through fine textiles, jewelry of gold and lapis lazuli, and elaborately braided hair. Perfumes made from oils and herbs were common among the upper classes. Despite the simplicity of materials, Sumerians took pride in personal appearance. Even workers and farmers adorned themselves with beads or copper ornaments. Cleanliness held not just hygienic, but spiritual importance, associated with purity before the gods. Social hierarchy governed every aspect of life. At the top stood the ruling elite, kings, priests, and officials who controlled land, wealth, and religious rituals. Below them were merchants and craftsmen, forming a middle class that thrived on trade and production. Farmers made up the majority, toiling in the fields that fed the cities. At the bottom were slaves, often prisoners of war or debtors, who worked in households, temples, or on large estates. Though slaves had few rights, they could sometimes buy their freedom. This structured order was accepted as natural, a reflection of divine will. In the Sumerian mind, society mirrored the cosmos. Each person had a role, just as each god had a place in the heavens. Education was a privilege reserved mostly for the sons of the wealthy. The Adaba, or tablet house, was the world's first known school, where boys trained to become scribes. Their lessons were demanding. Hours spent copying cuneiform signs onto clay tablets under the stern eye of teachers. Scribes were essential to the functioning of society, keeping records of harvests, taxes, trade, and temple offerings. They occupied a respected position, bridging the worlds of labor and leadership. For most, however, learning came not from schools, but from experience, passed down through generations of work and tradition. Even in the midst of daily toil, the Sumerians found time for leisure and celebration. Music and dance filled festivals honoring the gods. Harps, lyres, and flutes accompanied hymns sung in temples. Board games, such as the royal game of Uruk, provided entertainment for both the wealthy and the common folk. On holy days, people gathered in processions, offering food, incense, and song to their deities. These moments of joy and ritual gave life rhythm and meaning beyond survival. The Sumerian day ended much as it began, with the setting sun and the murmur of prayers. Families offered thanks to household gods, seeking protection through the night. In a world where the forces of nature were unpredictable, faith was both comfort and necessity. And yet beneath that constant dependence on the divine, there was also pride in human skill, labor, and persistence. For the ordinary Sumerian, life was not easy, but it was purposeful. Every brick laid, every canal dug, every loaf of bread baked contributed to something far greater than the individual. They were the builders of the first urban civilization, people whose hands and hearts shaped the world as earliest cities. In their daily struggle, they revealed a timeless truth. That civilization is not born from kings and monuments alone, but from the quiet endurance of ordinary lives. To understand the world of ancient Sumer, one must first understand its gods. Religion was not merely a part of life. It was life itself. Every sunrise, every harvest, every flood, and every breath was believed to depend on the will of unseen divine powers. The Sumerians lived in constant dialogue with their gods, a relationship woven through devotion, fear, and obligation. Their cities were built as offerings, their labor as service, and their stories as echoes of the eternal forces that ruled both heaven and earth. And each Sumerian city belonged to a specific deity, regarded as the city's true ruler. The people were seen as caretakers of the god's earthly domain. Uruk was devoted to Inanna, goddess of love, war, and fertility. Nippur honored Enlil, lord of the wind and the divine decree. Eridu revered Enki, the wise god of water and creation, whose realm lay in the subterranean abyss. These gods were not distant ideals. They were deeply human in emotion and behavior, capable of anger, jealousy, compassion, and desire. To the Sumerians, the gods reflected the same struggles and contradictions they saw in themselves, only magnified across the heavens. At the heart of each city stood its temple, the ziggurat, a towering stepped structure that reached toward the sky. It was the most visible symbol of faith, an architectural bridge between the human and divine realms. The temple complex was far more than a place of worship. It was the city's economic and administrative hub. Priests managed vast estates owned by the gods, oversaw irrigation systems, and stored the surplus grain that sustained the population in lean times. In effect, temples functioned as both banks and bureaucracies. To serve the gods was also to manage the city's lifeblood. Rituals governed every moment of temple life. Priests offered daily sacrifices of food, incense, and drink to nourish the gods' statues, not as symbols, but as literal embodiments of divine presence. These sacred images were washed, dressed, and fed with great ceremony. Music filled the air, and hymns written in the earliest forms of cuneiform were chanted to ensure the gods remained content. Festivals punctuated the year, marking planting and harvest seasons, celestial events, and mythic anniversaries. During these times, processions wound through the streets, carrying statues of deities from one temple to another, reenacting the cosmic stories that gave meaning to human life. One of the most prominent religious figures was the En, a high priest or priestess who served as the earthly representative of the city's god. In Uruk, the En of Inanna was often a woman of noble birth, symbolically married to the goddess in sacred rituals that renewed fertility and cosmic balance. Through these rites, the Sumerians believed they sustained the harmony between heaven and earth, a fragile equilibrium that could be broken by neglect or sin. Sumerian mythology was a vast tapestry of divine narratives that explained not only creation, but the meaning of existence itself. In their creation myths, the universe began as a watery chaos from which the gods shaped the heavens, the earth, and mankind. Humans, they believed, were created to serve the gods, to build their temples, grow their food, and maintain the order of the world. It was not a relationship of equality, but of duty. The gods gave life, and in return, humans offered labor and reverence. Yet the myths also revealed moments of rebellion, mercy, and tragedy, reflecting the complexity of the divine. Among these stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh stands as the most enduring. Though written centuries later, its roots stretch deep into Sumerian tradition. Gilgamesh, the mighty king of Uruk, is part mortal and part divine, a figure who embodies humanity's eternal struggle against mortality. His journey in search of immortality captures the Sumerian view of life, fleeting, fragile, yet capable of greatness. It reflects a belief that while humans could not escape death, they could achieve immortality through legacy, memory, and creation, through the cities, art, and words they left behind. Fear of divine anger was ever present. Natural disasters, disease, or failed harvests were seen as signs that the gods had been offended. To restore balance, priests performed elaborate rituals of atonement, offering sacrifices or reciting prayers to appease wrathful deities. Dreams and omens were taken seriously, interpreted by temple diviners who sought to understand the gods' will. Every action, from planting crops to signing trade agreements, was preceded by consultation with the divine through rituals or divination. Religion also reinforced the social order. The king ruled not by personal right, but as the chosen servant of the gods. His authority was divine, his victories signs of divine favor. The temple's wealth and influence ensured that faith and power were inseparable. To defy the temple was to defy the cosmos itself. Yet this system also created unity. In a world without centralized empires, religion bound the scattered city-states together under a shared vision of divine order and purpose. Through their myths, temples, and rituals, the Sumerians created more than a belief system. They created a worldview. Theirs was a cosmos alive with intention, where gods breathed through rivers, stars, and storms. To live in Sumer was to live in service to something greater than oneself, to recognize that human life was both fragile and sacred, caught between dust and divinity. Every brick of the ziggurat, every offering of bread and incense, every whispered prayer beneath the blazing Mesopotamian sun was a testament to this faith. The Sumerians believed that as long as they honored their gods, the world would remain in order. And so day after day they prayed, built and dreamed, not just to please their deities, but to sustain the delicate balance that held the universe together. Long before the world knew books, alphabets or libraries, the Sumerians discovered a way to make thought permanent. Out of necessity rather than artistry, they invented something that would transform humanity forever: writing. It began not as poetry or myth, but as a practical solution to a very human problem: keeping track of things. In the growing cities of Sumer, where trade thrived and temples managed vast quantities of grain, wool and silver, memory alone was no longer enough. Transactions had to be recorded, debts remembered, and property accounted for. From this need, around 3200 BCE, emerged the first written language, cuneiform. The earliest Sumerian scribes used small, flat pieces of wet clay as their canvas. With a sharpened reed stylus, they pressed wedge-shaped marks into the surface, simple at first but revolutionary in purpose. Each mark represented an object or number: a jar of oil, a herd of sheep, a measure of barley. These pictographs evolved from the practice of using small clay tokens which had been used for centuries to count goods. Over time, instead of keeping separate tokens, scribes began pressing their symbols directly into tablets, creating a durable and portable record. Once dried in the sun or baked in kilns, these tablets could last for millennia. This humble act of pressing marks into clay gave birth to written communication. Cuneiform, from the Latin cunus, meaning wedge, would become the writing system that carried humanity from prehistory into history. Its earliest use was administrative, recording temple offerings, trade agreements, harvest yields, and labor assignments. Thousands of such tablets have survived, providing an extraordinary window into the organization of the first cities. They are the world's earliest archives, silent yet eloquent witnesses of human civilization taking its first steps toward complexity. As Sumerian society grew more intricate, so too did their script. What began as pictorial symbols gradually became abstract signs representing syllables and sounds. This change transformed writing from a tool of accountants into a medium for expression. Scribes trained in temple schools called edubas mastered hundreds of signs and their variations. Their education was demanding, repetitive, precise, and lifelong. But with each generation, the script became more flexible, capable of recording not only numbers and names, but thoughts, prayers, and laws. The scribes' clay tablets began to tell stories. Myths, hymns, and wisdom texts emerged from the same styluses that once recorded grain shipments. The boundary between the sacred and the bureaucratic blurred, as priests and scribes collaborated to preserve the words of gods and kings alike. Writing gave permanence to the fleeting, a means for ideas to outlast the people who conceived them. Through cuneiform, the Sumerians began to conquer time itself. Among their greatest literary achievements stands the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story born from centuries of oral tradition before being etched into clay. Its earliest fragments date to Sumerian versions of the hero's adventures, which were later expanded by Akkadian scribes. The tale of Gilgamesh, the mighty king of Uruk, transcended its local roots to become one of humanity's first great works of literature. It told of friendship, loss, and the desperate quest for immortality, themes that still resonate thousands of years later. In it, Gilgamesh's journey mirrors the human condition, the struggle to find meaning in a world ruled by mortality. The existence of Gilgamesh and other Sumerian myths marks a turning point in human consciousness. Writing, once confined to counting goods, now preserved the soul of a culture. It carried emotion, morality, and imagination. For the first time, memory was no longer bound to living voices. It could be stored, copied, and revived across generations. The written word allowed knowledge to accumulate, to grow beyond what any single mind could hold. Cuneiform's reach extended far beyond Sumer. As neighboring peoples adopted and adapted it, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, the script became the universal medium of the ancient Near East. It was used for royal decrees, treaties, and even letters between kings separated by hundreds of miles. This shared written language created a web of communication that spanned empires long before paper or printing were imagined. Yet for all its sophistication, writing in Sumer retained its sacred aura. The act of inscribing words onto clay was itself a ritual, bridging the mortal and the divine. Many tablets began with invocations to gods, asking for clarity or blessing. Writing was seen as a gift from Enki, the god of wisdom, who had bestowed intelligence upon humanity. To write was to participate in creation, to shape reality through symbols. The power of cuneiform lay not only in what it recorded, but in what it revealed. Through it, we glimpse the lives of ordinary people. Contracts between merchants, prayers for health, recipes for beer, and even school exercises filled with mistakes and corrections. These small, everyday documents remind us that writing did not just belong to kings and priests. It belonged to a society learning to define itself through words. By giving form to thought, the Sumerians created the foundation upon which all later civilizations would build. From their wedge-shaped marks would eventually emerge alphabets, poetry, laws, and literature. Every written language, in some distant way, traces its lineage back to those first impressions in clay. The dawn of writing was more than a technological breakthrough. It was the awakening of humanity's collective memory. In the flicker of a reed stylus against wet clay, the Sumerians achieved immortality. Their world may have turned to dust, but their words endure, whispering across 5,000 years to tell us who they were, what they believed, and how they dreamed. Sumer was a land of contradictions, fertile yet barren, abundant yet lacking. Its rivers made the soil rich and capable of producing great harvests, but beyond the shimmering canals and green fields lay emptiness. The plains of southern Mesopotamia had no forests, no mountains, and almost no minerals. There was clay in abundance and reeds from the marshes, but little else. This scarcity forced the Sumerians to look beyond their own horizons. Out of necessity, they became traders, innovators, and economic pioneers. Their hunger for resources set in motion the first long-distance trade networks in human history, connecting distant peoples in a web of exchange that would shape civilizations for millennia to come. Agriculture was the foundation of the Sumerian economy. The irrigation systems that had turned arid plains into farmland allowed for consistent and productive harvests. Barley was the principal crop, hardy and reliable, forming the base of both diet and commerce. It was so central that it even became a standard unit of value, a kind of ancient currency. Surpluses of grain, wool, and textiles became Sumer's main exports, exchanged for materials the land could not provide. Every field, canal, and storage room was part of a grand economic machine, overseen by temples and palace administrators who meticulously recorded every transaction on clay tablets. Because Sumer lacked metal, timber, and stone, trade was not optional, it was essential. The temples, as the largest landowners and economic institutions, organized large-scale trading expeditions. Caravans of donkeys loaded with grain, wool, and crafted goods traveled across the deserts and plains, while boats made of reeds or wood sailed down the Euphrates and along the Persian Gulf. In return, traders brought back copper from Oman, tin from Anatolia, cedar from Lebanon, silver from Iran, and precious stones like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. These imported materials were transformed by Sumerian craftsmen into tools, jewelry, and ceremonial objects of remarkable beauty. The routes they established were not short or easy. Merchants faced scorching heat, bandits, and long stretches of desert. Yet these journeys created the first arteries of international commerce. Over time, trading outposts and colonies appeared along major routes, allowing Sumerian goods and ideas to spread far beyond Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence shows that Sumerian-style seals and pottery reached regions as distant as the Indus Valley and Egypt. In this way, the Sumerians became the first true global traders, linking cultures that had never before been connected. Trade also inspired innovation in record-keeping and economic management. The complexity of long-distance exchange required a reliable system to track agreements, debts, and deliveries. Cuneiform writing, initially developed for local accounting, evolved to handle these broader needs. Clay tablets preserved contracts specifying quantities, payment terms, and guarantees between merchants. Cylinder seals, intricately carved stones rolled across wet clay, served as personal signatures, verifying identity and authority. These were the world's first business documents and legal instruments, ensuring trust in transactions that spanned great distances. The economy of Sumer functioned through a delicate balance between temple, palace, and private enterprise. The temple economy was vast and organized, controlling land, labor, and storage. Workers were paid in rations of grain, oil, or beer, recorded with precision. The palace economy, led by kings and officials, oversaw military and civic projects, from canal construction to temple maintenance. But within and around these systems, private merchants operated as independent agents, sometimes representing the temple's interests, other times pursuing their own profit. This blend of institutional and personal trade created a dynamic economy far more sophisticated than one might expect from a Bronze Age society. Currency, as we know it today, did not yet exist, but the Sumerians developed standardized measures of value. Silver and barley were the two main units of exchange, used to price goods and settle debts. Labor, too, had a measurable worth. For example, a worker's monthly wage might be quantified in liters of barley or silver shekels. Such systems of standardization allowed for contracts, loans, and investments, the early foundations of finance. The Sumerians, in essence, invented the concept of economic regulation and accountability. This system of exchange extended into social life. Temples not only distributed resources, but acted as banks and warehouses, lending goods to farmers or merchants and collecting repayments after harvest or trade. Inscriptions show detailed lists of interest rates and repayment terms, the first evidence of organized credit. Economic life was inseparable from religion. The gods were considered ultimate owners of all wealth, and trade was conducted under their divine oversight. Every transaction, therefore, was both a business act and a sacred duty. Through trade, Sumer's cities grew wealthy and cosmopolitan. Markets were filled with goods from distant lands, metals gleaming beside baskets of dates, fine textiles displayed next to imported stones. Foreign traders brought new languages, customs, and ideas, enriching Sumerian culture with influences from abroad. The exchange was not merely material, it was intellectual. New technologies, such as improved metallurgy and shipbuilding, often traveled along the same routes as trade goods. The economic dynamism of Sumer also created inequality. While temples and palaces accumulated vast wealth, many commoners remained dependent on rations or small plots of land. Debt slavery became common, as farmers who could not repay loans were forced into servitude. Still, the system endured for centuries, sustained by its efficiency and adaptability. It provided stability in a world that often seemed unpredictable. In the end, the Sumerians' lack of natural resources became their greatest strength. It compelled them to invent the very systems, trade, record-keeping, contracts, credit, and standardized value, that would form the backbone of future economies. Through necessity, they discovered the power of exchange, transforming scarcity into opportunity. Their networks of commerce laid the groundwork for the economies of Babylon, Assyria, Persia, and beyond. The story of Sumer's economy is not just one of trade and wealth, but of connection. The moment when humanity first reached out beyond its borders to build relationships through commerce. In their pursuit of the materials they lacked, the Sumerians discovered something even more valuable: the ability to link worlds together. The Sumerians were not only builders of cities and temples, they were also builders of knowledge. Faced with the challenges of survival in an unforgiving environment, they turned observation, experimentation, and record-keeping into tools of progress. What began as practical problem-solving evolved into the earliest forms of science and technology. In their fields, canals, and temples, the Sumerians laid the intellectual foundations for mathematics, engineering, astronomy, and measurement, disciplines that still shape our world today. Their most vital innovation was irrigation. The rivers that sustained Sumer were both generous and destructive, flooding unpredictably, and leaving behind layers of fertile silt. To thrive, the Sumerians had to master the art of controlling water. They built an intricate network of canals, dikes, reservoirs, and levees that turned arid plains into productive farmland. These systems required constant maintenance and coordination, demanding precise planning and labor organization. Engineers measured water levels, managed flow between fields, and repaired channels after floods. The success of their cities depended entirely on this hydraulic mastery. It was not just agriculture, it was applied science. Through irrigation, the Sumerians learned to calculate distance, volume, and time. They needed to know how long a canal should be, how much water would flow through it, and how to distribute that water fairly among farmers. Out of these calculations came the birth of mathematics. Using small clay tokens and later cuneiform numerals, they developed a numerical system based on the number 60, the sexagesimal system that still defines how we divide hours into minutes and circles into degrees. To the Sumerians, 60 was a perfect number, easily divisible and ideal for complex computation. Their understanding of fractions, multiplication, and division allowed them to solve practical problems in construction, trade, and astronomy. Mathematics in Sumer was not abstract, but deeply practical. Clay tablets discovered in ancient schools show exercises in measuring fields, calculating brick quantities, and converting weights. They understood geometric principles well enough to design temples with precise symmetry and to calculate the surface area of irregular plots of land. Over time, their arithmetic expanded into more sophisticated forms, paving the way for later Babylonian advances in algebra and geometry. In their need to measure the world, the Sumerians had begun to quantify it, an intellectual leap that would echo through history. Astronomy, too, began as a practical necessity. Farmers needed to predict the flooding of rivers and the change of seasons, and priests sought to align rituals with celestial cycles. From the roofs of ziggurats and temple courtyards, Sumerian observers charted the movements of the stars, planets, and moon. They divided the year into 12 lunar months and recognized the repeating patterns of the heavens as signs of divine order. Over generations, these observations evolved into the first calendars, which guided agriculture, religious ceremonies, and trade. The Sumerian calendar was a triumph of early scientific observation. It combined lunar months with solar cycles, requiring periodic adjustments to maintain accuracy, a concept that would later influence the calendars of Egypt, Babylon, and even the modern world. By connecting time to celestial motion, the Sumerians introduced humanity to the idea that the universe followed predictable laws, an insight that laid the groundwork for all later astronomy. Technology flourished alongside science. The Sumerians were skilled inventors, constantly refining tools to improve efficiency. Around 3500 BCE, they developed the wheel, first used for pottery, then adapted for transport. Wheeled carts revolutionized trade and labor, enabling heavier loads to move across greater distances. They also created the plow, turning agriculture from backbreaking manual work into a more productive system. The combination of irrigation and plowing transformed the Mesopotamian plain into one of the most fertile regions on Earth. In metallurgy, they learned to mix copper with tin to produce bronze, ushering in the Bronze Age. Bronze tools and weapons were stronger and more durable than their stone predecessors, giving Sumerian artisans and soldiers an advantage over neighboring peoples. Blacksmiths, potters, and builders all benefited from this technological leap, creating goods that enhanced trade and everyday life. Every new discovery, whether in farming or craftsmanship, fed into a larger cycle of innovation. Sumerian architecture reflected both engineering skill and aesthetic vision. Without access to stone, they built with mud brick, developing advanced techniques to construct walls, vaults, and terraces that could endure for centuries. The ziggurats, those massive tiered temples, were feats of engineering precision. They used baked brick for outer layers, waterproofed with bitumen, and filled the interiors with mud brick cores to provide stability. Each step of these monumental structures was carefully calculated, aligning with celestial directions and reflecting the order of the cosmos itself. Medicine, though deeply tied to religion, also revealed the beginnings of empirical thinking. Sumerian healers recorded treatments using herbs, oils, and incantations. Illness was often attributed to divine displeasure, yet some prescriptions show practical understanding. Poultices for wounds, antiseptic oils, and dietary recommendations. Even within their spiritual framework, the Sumerians observed cause and effect, testing remedies and recording outcomes. These practices laid the groundwork for later Babylonian and Assyrian medical traditions. What made Sumer's scientific and technological advances so extraordinary was their integration into everyday life. Knowledge was not confined to scholars or priests. It was embodied in farmers adjusting canal gates, builders calculating brick patterns, and traders weighing silver with standardized scales. Their inventions did not emerge from theory but from necessity, from the desire to bring order to chaos. In their quest to understand and control their world, the Sumerians discovered something profound, that observation, measurement, and calculation could reveal the hidden structure of reality. Their innovations, the wheel, the plow, the calendar, mathematics, and written records, became the tools through which humanity would build the future. Though their names have faded with time, their influence endures in every clock that measures 60 minutes, in every map that divides the globe by degrees, and in every bridge between nature and human thought. The Sumerians were not only the first engineers of civilization, they were the first scientists of the human story. In the shadow of ziggurats and the hum of busy markets, the Sumerians cultivated something that transcended survival, a profound appreciation for art, beauty, and expression. Though their world was governed by labor, ritual, and devotion, it was also filled with music, sculpture, and poetry. From the delicate carvings on temple walls to the haunting melodies played in royal courts, the Sumerians sought to give shape and sound to the divine order they believed surrounded them. Their art was not merely decoration, it was communication, a language of beauty that connected gods, kings, and commoners alike. Sumerian art reflected their dual nature, practical and spiritual, earthly and cosmic. Most of their creations were made from humble materials, clay, stone, shell, and metal. Yet the craftsmanship was meticulous. Every object, from a simple bowl to an ornate statue, carried meaning. Temples and palaces were adorned with reliefs depicting scenes of worship, warfare, and ceremony. These images were not just for admiration, they were prayers in physical form, expressions of loyalty and reverence. The artists who carved them worked with steady hands and clear intention, believing that beauty could please the gods as much as offerings of food or incense. Among their most iconic works are the votive statues, small stone figures left in temples as perpetual stand-ins for worshippers. With clasped hands and wide, unblinking eyes, they embody the eternal devotion of those who placed them there. The exaggerated eyes, often inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli, symbolized attentiveness to the divine, a readiness to see and be seen by the gods. Each statue was unique, bearing the likeness and name of the person it represented, an early expression of individuality within a collective act of faith. The materials used in Sumerian art tell the story of their far-reaching trade connections. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, gold from Anatolia, and seashells from the Persian Gulf all found their way into the workshops of Sumer. Artisans transformed these rare materials into jewelry, cylinder seals, and ritual objects of stunning intricacy. Cylinder seals, in particular, were both functional and artistic. Carved with detailed scenes and rolled over wet clay, they served as personal signatures for merchants, priests, and officials. The images engraved upon them, of gods, animals, and mythological beings, formed miniature masterpieces that revealed the beliefs and daily life of their owners. Sumerian sculpture emphasized order and symmetry, mirroring the harmony they sought in their society. Whether representing kings, priests, or deities, figures were portrayed with calm, composed features, embodying control and divine balance. Monumental statues of rulers like Gudea of Lagash show them seated or standing in prayerful poses, hands folded and gaze fixed forward, a visual manifestation of leadership grounded in piety. The inscriptions carved along their robes described their accomplishments and offerings, blending word and image into a single sacred narrative. The walls of temples and palaces were filled with mosaics and reliefs made from colored stones and shells set in bitumen. The famous Standard of Ur, discovered in the royal tombs of Ur, captures Sumerian life in extraordinary detail. One side shows scenes of war, chariots charging, soldiers marching, captives being led away. The other depicts peace, banquets, music, and celebration. Together, they illustrate the dual forces that defined their civilization: conquest and culture, power and pleasure. The same people who invented writing and irrigation also composed music and feasted under the stars. Music held a special place in Sumerian culture, woven into both daily life and sacred ritual. Archaeologists have uncovered lyres, harps, flutes, and drums buried alongside kings and queens, a testament to the deep connection between sound and spirituality. The bull-headed lyre from Ur, adorned with gold and lapis, is one of the earliest known stringed instruments. Its imagery combines human and animal figures in scenes that suggest both myth and ceremony. The Sumerians believed music could bridge the mortal and divine realms, accompanying prayers, processions, and temple offerings. Each note was thought to please the gods and maintain cosmic harmony. Musicians were valued members of society. Temples employed choirs and instrumentalists, and royal courts hosted performances during feasts and celebrations. The Sumerians developed a system of musical notation, simple but groundbreaking, using cuneiform signs to record tones and rhythms. This early notation laid the groundwork for future civilizations to formalize music as a written art. Through melody and rhythm, they expressed joy, sorrow, reverence, and longing, the full spectrum of human emotion. Poetry and literature were also forms of artistic expression. Hymns written in cuneiform celebrated the gods and recounted mythic events. Priests and poets composed songs for Inanna, the goddess of love and war, describing her beauty and power in language that still feels vivid today. One ancient hymn praises her as the light of heaven, the bringer of fertility and chaos alike. These writings reveal a people deeply attuned to the emotional depth of their existence, capable not only of building cities, but of contemplating love, loss, and eternity. Even in their architecture, the Sumerians infused function with artistry. The ziggurats that towered over their cities were not only feats of engineering but symbols of aesthetic and spiritual aspiration. The ascending tiers, painted in vibrant colors and aligned with celestial directions, reflected their belief that beauty and symmetry could mirror divine perfection. Inside, walls were decorated with geometric patterns and doorways were inscribed with prayers, merging design with devotion. In the everyday world, art surrounded them. In the patterns woven into textiles, the painted pottery used at meals, and the jewelry worn by men and women alike. Beauty was a shared experience, not reserved for the elite. Even modest households owned small amulets or figurines meant to bring good fortune or ward off evil spirits. What emerges from the art and music of Sumer is a portrait of a people who understood the power of creation, not only to build and survive, but to express and transcend. Their works captured the rhythm of life, the balance between heaven and earth, labor and joy, faith and imagination. Though thousands of years have passed, the artistry of Sumer still speaks with quiet eloquence. In their carved stones and silent lyres, we can sense their yearning to leave behind something enduring. To say in the language of beauty, we were here, we dreamed, we sang. In the cradle of Sumer, where rivers met and cities first rose from the mud, humanity faced a new and complex challenge: how to live together under rules. As communities grew into city-states and fields into vast networks of canals, simple customs no longer sufficed to keep order. Conflict over water, property, and trade became inevitable. From these tensions emerged one of humanity's greatest inventions: law. The Sumerians were the first to transform the idea of fairness into written rules, giving birth to governance, justice, and the authority of kingship. At the dawn of their civilization, leadership was closely tied to religion. Each city-state, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, and others, believed itself under the protection of a patron god. The ruler, or Ensi, was both governor and high priest, acting as the earthly representative of the divine. His role was not absolute at first. He was a steward, managing land and resources on behalf of the gods. The temple stood at the heart of political power, serving as both the spiritual and administrative center. But as cities expanded and rivalries grew, rulers began to claim more personal authority, evolving into kings, Lugal, or great man. This transformation marked the beginning of monarchy. The king was seen as chosen by the gods to maintain order and prosperity. He commanded armies, oversaw construction, and enforced laws. Yet his power was not unchecked. Legitimacy came from fulfilling divine will and ensuring justice. When kings failed in these duties, when floods came, crops failed, or enemies triumphed, the people believed the gods had withdrawn their favor. Kingship was as much a burden as a privilege, and it demanded constant proof through action and success. The earliest known rulers, like Enmebaragesi of Kish and Gilgamesh of Uruk, were celebrated not just for conquest, but for restoring balance in times of chaos. Their stories, half history and half legend, reflected the Sumerian belief that good governance was a sacred mission. A king who ruled justly was a partner to the gods. One who ruled with greed or cruelty brought ruin. Out of this divine mandate grew the idea of codified law, rules that existed beyond any single person's will. The Sumerians were the first to write these rules down, carving them into clay for all to see. Among the earliest surviving examples is the Code of Uruk of Lagash, dating to around 2350 BCE. Though only fragments remain, it reveals a concern for social justice rare for its time. Uruk sought to protect the weak from the powerful, proclaiming that widows and orphans should not be wronged and that taxes and temple fees should not burden the poor. He described his reforms as a return to order, a restoration of fairness that had been lost. A century later came the Code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest known legal code preserved in full form. Written around 2100 BCE in the city of Ur, it predates Hammurabi's famous Babylonian laws by centuries. The Code of Ur-Nammu established penalties for crimes such as theft, adultery, and assault, and it introduced the principle of proportional justice, punishment fitting the crime. Instead of the brutal eye-for-an-eye approach that would appear later, many Sumerian laws relied on fines and restitution. If a man caused another injury, he paid with silver. If he damaged property, he compensated the owner. Justice was meant to restore balance, not merely to punish. The very act of writing laws was revolutionary. It shifted justice from personal vengeance to collective order. Before this, disputes were settled by family councils or temple priests, guided by custom and intuition. Once laws were inscribed in clay, they became public, unchanging, and, in theory, impartial. No longer could the powerful twist justice at will, for the laws were visible to all who could read them, and the scribes who preserved them acted as guardians of truth. Legal administration became a key part of Sumerian governance. Courts were established in temples or palaces, with judges chosen from among elders, priests, or royal officials. They heard cases involving land, debt, marriage, and crime, using written codes as reference. Witnesses gave testimony under oath to the gods, for perjury was both a moral and spiritual offense. Contracts, for marriage, trade, or property, were sealed in clay, witnessed, and stored in temple archives. These tablets, thousands of which survive today, are the earliest records of legal and economic life, evidence of a society that valued accountability. Kings, in turn, used law to strengthen their legitimacy. Ur-Nammu, Shulgi, and later rulers declared themselves guardians of justice, boasting in inscriptions that they did not deliver the orphan to the rich, nor the widow to the mighty. These proclamations were both moral and political, reinforcing the idea that divine favor depended on fairness. A just ruler ensured peace, an unjust one invited rebellion and divine wrath. The intertwining of law and religion gave Sumerian justice a unique depth. Courts often began proceedings with prayers or offerings to the gods. The concept of divine decrees that governed all aspects of existence, suggested that order itself was sacred. To violate law was not merely a crime against society, it was a disruption of the cosmic balance established by the gods. This belief infused every level of governance, from the king's throne to the farmer's field. Yet Sumerian justice was not entirely equal. Social hierarchies shaped the value of punishment. Nobles, commoners, and slaves were not judged by the same standard. Compensation varied by status, reflecting the rigid structure of their society. Still, even within these limits, the Sumerians' pursuit of codified fairness marked an extraordinary step toward the rule of law. The idea that justice could be reasoned, written, and preserved. Administration grew increasingly sophisticated. Bureaucrats recorded census data, tax payments, and labor assignments. Officials, known as dub-sao, scribes, maintained the lifeblood of the state. Thousands of tablets documenting everything from grain rations to temple repairs. The Sumerian city was, in many ways, the first bureaucracy, governed not by impulse, but by documentation. As Sumerian power gave way to Akkadian and Babylonian successors, the legacy of their legal thought endured. Hammurabi's famous code, centuries later, would echo Ur-Nammu's principles of proportional justice and divine kingship. The Sumerians had planted the seed that a civilization could be held together not just by force but by law, and that justice, once written, could outlast the hands that inscribed it. Through their laws and institutions, the Sumerians transformed the raw struggle for power into a structured system of order. They proved that human society could be governed by reason, fairness, and moral duty. In their clay tablets of decrees and judgments lies the first whisper of a truth that would echo through every court and constitution to come. That civilization depends not only on strength, but on justice. The cities of Sumer were born side by side along the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, close enough to trade, close enough to fight. From the very beginning, their prosperity depended on cooperation, yet their ambitions led them into endless rivalry. Each city-state, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Kish, Ur, believed its god was supreme and its destiny divinely ordained. But in a land where irrigation canals crossed borders and fertile fields were scarce, even divine favor could not prevent conflict. Out of this tension arose some of the first organized wars in human history, and, just as importantly, the first attempts at diplomacy. In Sumer, the roots of war were practical as much as ideological. Control over water meant control over life. Cities competed for access to rivers and the fertile land between them. Canals often crossed boundaries, and when one city diverted water for its own fields, another could face drought and famine. These disputes escalated quickly from local quarrels to military campaigns. The kings of Sumer became not only builders and priests, but generals, protectors of their people and conquerors in the name of their gods. The earliest depictions of warfare come from carved stelae and mosaics, where kings are shown leading armies into battle. The most famous of these, the Stele of the Vultures from Lagash, commemorates a victory over the neighboring city of Umma around 2450 BCE. It shows soldiers in tight formation, spears raised, marching behind their ruler, Eannatum. The imagery is both brutal and ceremonial. Rows of slain enemies lie beneath vultures circling overhead, while Eannatum stands triumphant, his victory sanctified by the gods. War in Sumer was not merely a contest of strength, it was a sacred act, waged under divine sanction. The armies of Sumer were disciplined and organized, remarkable for their time. Soldiers were drawn from the general population, but as city-states grew wealthier, they began to maintain professional forces. These early armies used weapons of bronze, spears, axes, and daggers, along with large rectangular shields made of leather and wood. The phalanx-like formation depicted on ancient carvings suggests tactical sophistication. Lines of infantry advancing in coordination, protecting one another with shields as they pressed forward. Chariots, too, made their first appearance in Sumer. Early models were clumsy by later standards, heavy four-wheeled carts drawn by donkeys rather than horses, yet they represented a major innovation. Used for both battle and ceremony, chariots symbolized status and power. Kings rode them into combat or parades, embodying both the might of the army and the glory of divine kingship. Over time, chariot warfare would evolve into one of the defining features of ancient military strategy across Mesopotamia and beyond. But the Sumerians were not only warriors, they were strategists. They understood that victory on the battlefield was only one part of power. Alliances, treaties, and diplomacy played a crucial role in maintaining balance between rival cities. When conflict became too costly, Kings turned to negotiation, swearing oaths before the gods to uphold peace. These agreements were solemnly recorded on clay tablets, sealed with the marks of both parties. The gods themselves were called as witnesses, a reminder that breaking a treaty was not merely treachery, but sacrilege. One of the earliest known treaties in history, between Lagash and Umma, dates from around 2500 BCE. It settled a long-standing border dispute by dividing agricultural land and establishing boundaries marked by stone stelae. The text invokes the god Enlil as guarantor, warning that divine punishment would fall upon whoever violated the pact. Though temporary, this peace treaty represents a milestone, the birth of diplomacy as a structured practice. Despite these attempts at balance, warfare remained constant. Ambitious kings sought to expand their territories, not only for land but for prestige. Each victory was a statement of divine favor, proof that a city's god was stronger than its rivals. The spoils of war, grain, livestock, slaves, and tribute, enriched temples and palaces, fueling further expansion. Cities rose and fell in cycles of power, their fortunes shifting with each generation. As conflicts grew, so did the concept of empire. Around 2330 BCE, Sumer was unified for the first time under Sargon of Akkad, a figure who reshaped the political map of Mesopotamia. Though technically from outside the traditional Sumerian cities, Sargon adopted their culture, language, and administrative systems. His conquest marked the end of Sumer-Kraes independence, but also the beginning of a new political idea: centralized rule over multiple city-states. The Akkadian Empire that followed was the direct descendant of Sumer's endless rivalries, the culmination of centuries of struggle and ambition. Even in defeat, Sumer's influence endured. The Akkadians inherited Sumerian military organization, record-keeping, and the use of law and diplomacy to manage conquered lands. Sumerian scribes continued to write treaties, decrees, and battle accounts in cuneiform, ensuring that the legacy of Sumerian statecraft would shape every Mesopotamian empire to follow. The psychological impact of war was profound. The Sumerians, who viewed the world as governed by gods, saw conflict as both inevitable and divine. Victories were signs of divine approval. Defeats were interpreted as punishment or the withdrawal of favor. This worldview gave war a ritual dimension. Before battles, kings offered sacrifices to the gods and consulted oracles for omens. Soldiers marched into combat, believing they fought not merely for survival, but for cosmic balance. Yet amid the violence, there was also a recognition of the value of peace. Inscriptions from victorious kings often end not with boasts of slaughter, but with pledges to rebuild temples, restore fields, and ensure prosperity. Peace, when achieved, was celebrated as the highest blessing of the gods, a time when justice could flourish, canals could flow freely, and the city could thrive. The Sumerians thus gave humanity two intertwined legacies: the art of war and the art of peace. They taught future civilizations how to organize armies, build defenses, and conduct campaigns, but also how to negotiate, make treaties, and seek balance through law and diplomacy. They were the first to realize that power was not merely the ability to conquer, but the wisdom to control conflict. In the ruins of their cities and the fragments of their inscriptions, we can still sense that tension, the eternal struggle between ambition and order, chaos and civilization. In their wars, the Sumerians fought for survival. In their diplomacy, they laid the groundwork for cooperation. Both were necessary to sustain the fragile miracle they had built between the rivers. The story of Sumer's decline is not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling. A civilization that had risen from mud brick and ingenuity, gradually worn down by the very forces it had once mastered. For centuries, the Sumerians had built, irrigated, written, and traded their way into history's memory. Yet beneath their temples and ziggurats, the land itself was changing. The rivers that had given them life began to turn against them. The soil grew tired, and the balance between nature, people, and power began to slip away. The first cracks appeared in the environment. Sumer's prosperity had always depended on irrigation, but centuries of canal farming carried an invisible cost: salt. Each season, as water from the Tigris and Euphrates evaporated under the sun, It left behind thin layers of minerals. Over generations, those minerals accumulated, poisoning the soil. Barley, once abundant, began to wither. Fields that had fed thousands grew barren, and harvests dwindled. Archaeological records reveal a gradual decline in crop yields, forcing people to abandon farmlands and migrate northward in search of more fertile ground. Deforestation and overgrazing compounded the problem. The Sumerians needed wood for building, reeds for weaving, and livestock for food and labor, but their environment was fragile. The plains could not replenish what was taken, and the lack of natural forests forced them to import timber from distant lands, a costly dependence that made the economy increasingly unstable. What had once been the heart of abundance became a land strained to its limits. As the land weakened, so too did the cities. The great network of canal systems, masterpieces of early engineering, required constant maintenance. When central authority faltered, irrigation channels clogged or broke, leading to floods in some regions and droughts in others. The delicate balance that had sustained Sumer for millennia began to fail. Rival city-states turned inward, competing for scarce resources rather than uniting against shared threats. Internal divisions, once manageable, became fatal. It was in this moment of vulnerability that new powers rose. From the north came the Akkadians, a Semitic-speaking people who had long lived alongside the Sumerians, adopting much of their culture and language. Around 2330 BCE, Sargon of Akkad launched a campaign that would forever change Mesopotamia. He conquered the Sumerian cities one by one, uniting them under his rule and creating the world's first true empire. Sargon's conquest did not erase Sumerian culture, it absorbed it. The Akkadian administration retained Sumerian scribes, priests, and laws. The cuneiform script continued, now adapted to the Akkadian language. Sumerian religious traditions blended seamlessly into the new imperial framework. The gods of Uruk, Nippur, and Ur were worshipped alongside Akkadian deities, their myths rewritten in new tongues, but with familiar hearts. In a way, Sumer survived within its conquerors, becoming the intellectual and spiritual foundation of the Akkadian world. Yet even the Akkadian Empire inherited Sumer's environmental and political fragility. A century after Sargon's rise, the region faced renewed crises: droughts, failing harvests, and invasions by nomadic tribes from the surrounding deserts and mountains. Among these invaders were the Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains who descended upon Mesopotamia around 2150 BCE. They disrupted trade, looted cities, and broke the fragile unity the Akkadians had forged. The once thriving heart of civilization fragmented again into isolated city-states, each struggling to survive amid chaos. For a time, it seemed the light of Sumer had gone out. Temples fell into disrepair, writing declined, and political power dissolved. But history, like the rivers, has currents that run deep. Out of the ruins, new leaders emerged to revive the old cities. Chief among them was Ur-Nammu, who established the third dynasty of Ur around 2100 BCE, a final renaissance of Sumerian culture and governance. Ur-Nammu's reign was marked by restoration. Canals were repaired, temples rebuilt, and law codified in what became the earliest surviving complete legal code. Under his rule, and that of his successor Shulgi, Ur regained its status as a center of art, learning, and trade. Bureaucracy flourished, scribes produced thousands of administrative tablets, and Sumerian culture reached one last brilliant peak. But the revival could not last forever. The same environmental exhaustion and external pressures that had undone earlier dynasties returned. Nomadic Amorite tribes encroached from the west, while Elamite armies advanced from the east. Around 2004 BCE, Ur was sacked, and the Third Dynasty fell. This time, Sumer did not rise again as an independent power. The torch of Mesopotamian civilization passed to the Amorites, who founded Babylon to the north, a city that would inherit Sumer's legacy and carry it into a new age. Though the political structure of Sumer vanished, its spirit lived on. The Babylonians adopted the Sumerian gods, myths, and scientific knowledge, preserving them in their own language. The Epic of Gilgamesh, The great poem of Sumer was copied, translated, and retold for centuries. The cuneiform writing system, born in the temple accounting rooms of Uruk, continued to be used across Mesopotamia for more than 2,000 years. The very idea of law codified by Ur-Nammu would later echo in Hammurabi's famous code. Even Sumer's vision of kingship, the ruler as a divinely chosen guardian of justice and order, endured. The Babylonians, Assyrians, and Persians all inherited this concept, embedding it in the foundations of imperial rule. The Sumerians, though gone as a people, became the architects of civilization itself. Their decline, in the end, was not a failure, but a transformation. They had exhausted their land, fought their wars, and built beyond what the earth could sustain. Yet what they left behind, writing, law, art, mathematics, and myth, outlived their cities. The plains that once echoed with their hymns and harvests would never again belong to them, but the world they imagined continued to expand, carried forward by those who followed. Standing among the ruins of Ur and Lagash today, one can still see traces of their legacy baked into the sun-hardened bricks. The canals are dry, the ziggurats eroded, but the memory of Sumer remains, not as dust, but as the first great spark of human civilization. Though the cities of Sumer have long since turned to dust, their influence continues to pulse quietly beneath the surface of our modern world. Every time we write, measure time, divide a circle, tell a story, or seek justice, we echo the legacy of that ancient land between the rivers. Sumer, the first civilization, was more than a cluster of city-states. It was the birthplace of the human idea that we can shape our destiny through knowledge, order, and imagination. Their inventions were not merely tools for survival, but the foundations of what it means to live in a society. The Sumerians gave the world its first written language, cuneiform. What began as simple marks pressed into clay to record barley and sheep became a vehicle for myth, law, and philosophy. Writing turned memory into permanence. It allowed the past to speak to the future, transforming experience into history. From Sumerian scribes came the first libraries, archives, and schools, institutions that ensured knowledge would outlive its creators. Every alphabet, every printed page, every digital word can trace its lineage back to those early tablets of clay. Their concept of time remains with us as well. The Sumerians divided the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds, a system born from their base 60 mathematics. They charted the heavens with such precision that their methods still influence modern astronomy. The way we map the world, a circle divided into 360 degrees, is a direct inheritance of Sumerian calculation. Even the 7-day week, tied to celestial observations, has its roots in their cosmic order. In these small, unnoticed ways, we continue to live according to Sumerian logic every day. Equally enduring is their vision of law and justice. When Ur-Nammu inscribed the first code of laws, he did more than list punishments. He articulated the principle that society must be guided by reason and fairness rather than raw power. This notion became the cornerstone of later legal systems across the ancient world and eventually of modern governance. The very idea that rules should be written, accessible, and applied equally stems from that early understanding of justice as divine and human duty alike. In governance too, the Sumerians set precedents that still shape how we organize power. They conceived the state as a partnership between ruler, people, and gods, an intricate web of duty and legitimacy. Their kings were not tyrants by right, but stewards bound to uphold balance and prosperity. Though divine kingship evolved and changed, the concept of leadership as responsibility, that power carries moral weight, was one of Sumer's great gifts to humanity. Their innovations in science and technology laid the groundwork for centuries of advancement. The wheel, the plow, and the sail, all Sumerian creations, revolutionized movement, agriculture, and trade. Their irrigation systems transformed deserts into farmland, proving that human ingenuity could master nature's unpredictability. The principles of measurement and engineering they developed became the silent framework of every bridge, canal, and city that followed. The Sumerians taught humanity not just to adapt to the world, but to reshape it. In art and literature, their influence is equally profound. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written more than 4,000 years ago, remains one of the oldest surviving stories in human history, and still one of the most human. It speaks of friendship, ambition, mortality, and the search for meaning. When Gilgamesh mourns his lost companion and seeks the secret of eternal life, he speaks across millennia to our shared longing to understand what it means to be mortal. From this story, and others like it, all later literature inherits its heart, the idea that through storytelling, we preserve our humanity against time. The Sumerian worldview was one of order amid chaos. They believed the universe was fragile, that the gods had created humans to maintain balance through ritual, labor, and justice. To them, civilization was not a right, but a responsibility. Every canal dug, every temple raised, every law written was an act of preservation against the entropy that constantly threatened to undo creation. It was a worldview that taught humility, but also purpose, that human effort mattered in the cosmic scheme. In their myths, they saw themselves not as masters of nature, but as its caretakers, a lesson still resonant in an age when we grapple with the limits of our planet. Their culture spread far beyond their borders. The Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Persians all inherited and reinterpreted the Sumerian legacy. Through them, the Sumerian spirit flowed into the civilizations of Greece, Rome, and ultimately the modern world. The principles of writing, law, mathematics, and government that began in Sumer became the pillars of global civilization. The Sumerians may have vanished as a people, but they never truly disappeared. Their ideas became the architecture of human progress. Perhaps what is most striking about Sumer's legacy is how modern it feels. Their questions are our questions. How do we live together? What is justice? How can knowledge protect us from chaos? What remains after we are gone? They were the first to confront these dilemmas, to see beyond mere survival and reach for something eternal. They built not only walls and canals, but the very framework of human thought. To be the first civilization is to live without a blueprint, to invent, through trial and failure, the patterns by which all others would follow. The Sumerians did not know they were making history. They were simply trying to endure. Yet in doing so, they defined what civilization could be, a collective act of imagination, where memory, order, and creativity become the tools of endurance. Their clay tablets still whisper across time, the impressions of reeds pressed into wet earth by steady hands. In those marks lies the essence of humanity's oldest promise, that knowledge, once shared, can outlive its makers. The Sumerians were the first to turn that promise into reality. And though their temples crumble and their names fade, their spirit endures in every written word, every measured moment, every law and story that binds us together. Sumer was the beginning, the first great experiment in what it means to be human. And in many ways, we are all still living within its echo.